We're here with Stuart Soroka, professor in the Department of Communication and Political Science at UCLA. Welcome, Stuart. I'm really excited for you to tell us a little bit about the work you do in your lab at UCLA and the work that some of your students have done with Verasight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited about the work we've been doing.
Awesome. Yeah, so maybe you can just get us started by giving us an overview of what your lab is focused on and why it matters.
Sure. So I'm a political scientist by training in a communications department at UCLA. And most of my work has to do with the different aspects of political communication. I've done work on negativity biases and work on policy preferences and their representation in media, the way in which media can facilitate or do harm to a kind of efficient functioning of representative democracy. My lab is the Political Communication and Behavior Lab, based at UCLA, although we have some former members that have dispersed across the country and around the world. And that lab group is focused on a very broad range of topics in political communication. And I have several students who've run studies that involve essentially experiments embedded in surveys that they have used Verasight data for.
Amazing. That sounds like fascinating and important work. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about a couple of the student projects or student research efforts that you've supervised that have used Verasight data?
Absolutely. When I start with a paper by Seonhye No, Seonhye is just finishing her PhD in the department now. She's graduated and she's a postdoc at NYU starting in a few weeks. And she has a paper published in Journalism Studies. The paper is called Expressive News Preferences, Identity Signaling in News Selection. And that paper is based on, I think, a really innovative experiment embedded in an online survey in which Seonhye explores the possibility that when we ask people to select headlines that they would read, that part of that news selection isn't genuine and isn't, as in it doesn't genuinely reflect what they genuinely would read if they were reading news content. There's a kind of expressive component to it. So a manipulation for her is a standard headline selection task. And this is very standard in a lot of studies in political science and communication. Kind of you give people a list of headlines and you ask them to indicate the ones that they would read. And the idea is we've used this kind of work to explore how people choose what they read, essentially. Except that when you ask people to pick headlines, Seonhye argues, with no forced reading of those headlines, part of that headline selection becomes a more expressive task. So for instance, we might tend to, Seonhye argued, select articles that better reflect our preferences more when we know that this is kind of a selection game than when we know it's a reading task. So the manipulation for her is some people get a selection task and some people get a task that is reading. We'd like you to select headlines and you're going to read the article when you pick the headline. And then they do read the article when they pick the headline. And what she finds is forcing consumption produces less attitude consistent selection than no forced consumption. As in, we tend to read more broadly than we select in this kind of expressive way. And that has important implications methodologically for people who use headline tasks to study how people select news, because it means that those headline selection tasks produce a biased version of what we would actually read. But it also tells us something probably about the way in which people select and read news in real life. One of Seonhye's arguments is that we need to distinguish between different components of news engagement, the selection or liking or reposting and actual reading and maybe commenting on those posts. And the degree to which we see kind of selective exposure or in partisan selection or attitude consistent selection is going to vary across those different components of news engagement. I think it's a really fascinating study.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, thanks for sharing that example. And so could you dive a little bit more into the findings specifically? So it sounds like she argued and did find that there's a different selection depending on whether the individual in the study is reading the full content versus selecting a headline. Could you dive into like a little bit more of the nuances of what the findings were?
So the research design in this instance is focused on gun control. So Seonhye captures people's preferences about gun control using standard survey questions about gun control, and then presents them with articles that are clearly or anti gun control. And in fact, clearly not just in terms of the words used, but they're actually color coded to make it really clear that these are articles that are pro gun control and these articles that are anti gun control. And then for people in the selection manipulation, they're just told choose the headlines that you would read. She finds pretty consistently that people who are pro gun control select a bunch of pro gun control headlines. People who are anti gun control select a bunch of anti gun control headlines. Now, that is less true when she presents them with a manipulation that is, now I'm going to show you some articles. I'd like you to pick ones to read. And each time they pick one, they read it and they make subsequent selections. There's something in these results, I think, that indicates that we read more broadly than we perform, essentially. And that fits with work that suggests that echo chambers are a problem, but maybe not as bad as we initially assumed in our kind of interactions with others, that actually people aren't 100% Democrat or 100% Republican in their network. Other people find their way through. News works, I think, in a similar way. We're interested in reading more broadly. We still select attitude consistent material more frequently, but we're interested in reading more broadly than you might expect based on a headline experiment.
Fascinating. So the suggestion is when the participants in the study feel that they're selecting as part of an exercise to select headlines, they might be more strictly partisan in their process or in their decisions than if like actually consuming the content is part of the exercise.
That's exactly it. And that's the measurement version of it. But we can imagine a similar kind of dynamic out there in the world when people are making decisions about what to read versus what to post on social media, for instance.
Right.
That there is a kind of expressive component to, let's say, liking articles that we haven't even read that is different from, that misrepresents what we might actually read.
Right. So maybe if I'm scrolling social media, I feel a resonance with a certain post or a headline of an article that I'm liking, or I feel like I want to broadcast that or amplify it to the algorithm. And that maybe that's a totally different exercise or a significantly different exercise behaviorally than I'm going to actually open this up and learn from it or fully consume the content.
I think that's absolutely the argument in this piece and one of the implications in this piece.
Yeah.
The narrow implication is we really need, as researchers, to rethink what we're getting from headline selection tasks.
Right.
The broader implication is we need to think about these different forms of engagement with news content and how in-partisan selectivity exhibits itself differently when we're just liking or reposting versus when we're actually reading. This, I think, is one of Seonhye's kind of core contributions to the field.
Very cool. So you just mentioned kind of the implications for researchers. Could you describe that a little more? Like, are there follow-on studies that you would like to see, or maybe changes, adjustments to the approach for this kind of research that you'd like to see adopted going forward?
I mean, I think the most straightforward implication from Seonhye's paper is that if what we want to capture are people's genuine news reading preferences, then we have to make space for them to actually read the article in the context of the survey. That's very costly, of course. That's like a lot of time lost to people reading articles as opposed to just picking selection tasks. But that, I think, is the implication measurement-wise for the paper, that if you want genuine, or as close as we can get to genuine reading preferences, then we have to make them read. A cheaper, less good alternative, I think, if we care about real consumption preferences, is just to understand that in a headline selection task, what we're getting is an indication of genuine preferences, but also some performance. Maybe that headline selection task is exactly what we care about if we're interested in what people might do in terms of liking and reposting on social media.
Right.
But it is an imperfect reflection of what people read when they're actually reading the news themselves.
Yeah, speaking from Verasight's perspective, definitely more challenging and expensive, obviously, to get just a longer survey, right, and a more complex survey to get people to actually read. So I could see how maybe it could be like challenging or inconvenient in some ways to like really test it appropriately if the intent is to understand people's reading preferences. But it sounds like it's important, and we now have pretty strong evidence that in order to really get the results that we're trying to study in that case, it's important to do.
I think that's true. There is a more optimistic, like happier, cheaper interpretation as well. And that is that it's not like the consumption manipulation produced totally different outcomes than the selection manipulation. That there's a very strong correlation between those two. It's just that we're saying that you're going to need to read the article changes the balance of in-partisan versus out-partisan articles. So maybe the happier for existing research interpretation is actually asking people to just select headlines does a pretty good, slightly imperfect, but a pretty good job of getting at what they read. I think that would be a reasonable interpretation too.
Got it. Well, thanks so much for sharing that work, Stuart. That's absolutely fascinating and I think really valuable for political scientists and researchers and people interested in that topic. Would love to know if there's one or two more papers that you'd love to dive into as well.
I want to talk about at least one more for sure. So that was the paper we just talked about by Seonhye was published in Journalism Studies. This next paper is also published in Journalism Studies by June Luo. June was a PhD student at UCLA, and now she's an assistant professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen. Her paper is called Beyond Credibility, How News Topic and Cognitive Processing Shape Responses to AI-Authored Journalism. And it's addressing issues surrounding the use of AI in authoring news content. And I'm just going to focus on one particular result from that paper. But June runs, again, another experiment embedded in a survey in which she tries to capture participants' attitudes towards articles that are clearly authored by AI instead of or in addition to journalists. So basically, where the byline of an article, the manipulation is, in some cases, the byline of the article says that this was authored in part by AI or not. And June runs the experiment across two different topics to make sure that results are consistent across topic. And she finds, this is the finding that I really love. She finds that people are basically unaffected by the byline of a news article, and that how much they trust the article really is about their predispositions more than it is about whether AI authored that article. Now, importantly, she also finds amongst people who recognize that the article is AI authored, that within that group, people who trust AI more also trust the kind of credibility of the article more. So her results are not just random noise. The experiment did work. We can see people who trust AI more and recognize the article is written by AI, trusting that article more. That should be what happens, of course. But on the whole, the impact of AI authorship is completely insignificant. And that raises real questions about whether audiences are sufficiently equipped to deal with journalism as journalism is increasingly produced with the help of, if not entirely by, AI.
That's super interesting. So you mentioned kind of the treatment was a difference in the byline. Could you describe like exactly what, or roughly, if not exactly, what the change to the byline was, or like what the difference between, the AI credited version and the non-AI credited version was?
So June uses a 2x2 experiment in which there are articles about the economy and articles about immigration to make sure that things work the same way across two topics. And then within each topic, you're randomized into a treatment in which the article is the same, but the byline is different. So the human written article, for instance, says, by Taylor Morgan. And underneath it says, Taylor Morgan is a professional correspondent for the Chronicle Dispatch. Okay, the AI written version says, by Alex Tu is an AI journalist from Algorithmic Insight, a pioneer in AI-driven journalism. So a very clear human journalist versus AI signal. And articles are formatted in the way in which we typically see articles formatted. It looks like a regular article online, the headline, kind of one sentence take, and then actually with a picture, the byline, and then the article. We see minimal to basically no impact on the whole in switching the author to a computer. That's pretty disconcerting, I think, for people who are worried about how consumers will react to AI in journalism. It suggests that they won't react at all, that we can
Yeah.
just be getting a lot of AI journalism and we're just not thinking about it. And
Yep.
that's a big problem. I think that's a really important contribution June's made.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and I think very relevant, obviously, now and with the direction things are going. There's certainly incentive just structurally to use AI for writing, obviously, because it has the potential to lower costs. And you could it's easy to imagine organizations responding to that incentive even more strongly if there isn't necessarily a perceived difference in how the readers interact with or consume the content.
I think that's really well put, that there is a real lack of accountability in journalistic organizations if audiences are unaffected by the use of AI. When
Right.
June was first presenting this work to me, my initial response was, well, I mean, how much AI can there be in journalism? It's not like it's everywhere. And her response was, no, actually, it's everywhere. The wire
Yeah.
services are pretty explicit about their use of AI. Explicit,
Right.
not in the article itself, but they have like a post online that says, this is how we're using AI. But there is a lot of journalism that right now that is informed, at least partly, if not largely, by AI models. And
Yep.
that means that insofar as there are biases or gaps in what AI knows, there are biases or gaps in what that journalism is going to be able to produce.
Yep.
I think we want human eyes on these things. And ideally, we would like for people to have a degree of media literacy, essentially, that allows us to at least assess the article that we're reading in
Right.
light of whether it's been written by a human or a computer.
Well, that's another really fascinating and really important research project and paper. Is there any other work you'd like to share before we go, Stuart?
Let me give you one more that's a little bit different. Nate Clark is a PhD student in the political science department at UCLA right now. And he's just, as in 2 days ago, it was finished, just fielded a study with Verasight in which there are some embedded videos, an experiment in which he's playing with the way in which people interpret news content when it has or does not have music. Because social media platforms increasingly have made easy and pretty standard the kind of layering of music over news content. Initially, we didn't see it so much in professional news content. We saw it more in like individuals' posts about their dogs and things. But it is increasingly now a part of just like standard news organizations news posts on TikTok, for instance. And we know
Right.
that music can engage different emotions very effectively. So, and we know that when we are feeling different emotions, we encode information differently. So the choice of inserting music and inserting one song versus another song over an otherwise, let's call it objective news article might change pretty fundamentally the way in which we respond to that news content. This, I think, is a really interesting, exciting take on the way in which platforms are changing news consumption and maybe the way in which we understand the world around us. I think Nate's making a really interesting contribution there.
Fascinating. Would you want to just describe briefly I guess, is the survey still in the field or did it?
It is only just out of the field, so I have
Okay.
Nate has no results yet.
Well,
Just
that,
this terrific idea and then a survey experiment to capture it. And the manipulation is straightforward enough, right? The manipulation is inserting, I mean, you're randomized into treatments where you're getting the story with music and getting the story without music. And that is surrounded by questions about policy preferences and beliefs and the credibility of the content and the believability of the content, whether the content seems like a real news story or not. It might be that the difference the music makes is about how we understand an issue like homelessness, for instance, which is one of the issues in his content. But it might be that the music either makes something seem more credible or professional or less credible or less professional as well. But so far I've seen none of Nate's results yet. I'm very excited about what he's going to find.
awesome. Well, that's a perfect reason for us to talk again sometime in the near future. Super excited to hear the results from that study. And thank you so much for sharing and going in depth with me on all of the important work your researchers and students have been doing. It's an honor and a privilege for us to get to work with your students and researchers on such important topics. And I really appreciate your time, Stuart. Yeah, thanks so much.
And I appreciate your letting me talk about the student papers too, because I think they're really cool. And of course, promoting their work is important.
I loved it. You're clearly very like passionate about your students' work. So I think it really comes through, and I think it'll come through to the audience as well.
That's great. Thank you very much.